I never imagined it would come to this. I mean, who really does? You spend years building a life with someone, thinking you know them inside and out, and then in a blink, everything changes. It was just another ordinary night, or at least that's what I thought. Sarah was in the kitchen, humming one of her usual tunes, while I sat on the couch, scrolling through my phone. The soft buzz of the TV in the background was almost comforting, but I wasn't really paying attention to it. It was just noise to fill the space, to make the silence between us a little less obvious. I didn't need sound, but I wasn't immune to the weight of it either. Sarah had been a little off lately. I couldn't quite put my finger on it, but something wasn't right. The way she avoided eye contact, the way her smile never quite reached her eyes anymore. I tried to ignore it, to brush it off as stress from work or the band. We'd both been busy, and I hadn't been around as much as I should have. But then it happened. Her phone, which she'd left on the counter, lit up with a notification. Just one, harmless enough, but the name on the screen made my stomach drop. Mike, my best friend, my bandmate, my brother in every sense but blood. I wasn't the type to snoop, never had been, but something in me, some deep, gnawing instinct, made me reach for her phone. The screen opened without a passcode, and there it was. A string of messages. Not innocent, not harmless. Messages that left no room for misinterpretation. I didn't even need sound to hear the betrayal screaming at me from the words on the screen. My heart pounded in my chest, the vibration of it echoing through my body like the bass of a drum. I'd seen enough. I didn't want to see more. But I couldn't stop scrolling, my fingers moving of their own accord as the realization sunk in deeper with every message I read. Sarah had been cheating on me, with Mike. I don't know how long I sat there, numb, the phone clutched in my hand. It was like the ground had opened up beneath me, and I was falling into some dark, bottomless pit. Everything I thought I knew about my life, about us, was unraveling right in front of me. I felt sick. I wanted to confront her, to scream, to demand an explanation. But how do you even start that conversation when your world has just been ripped apart? Sarah came back into the room, her smile fading when she saw me holding her phone. She didn't need to ask what I'd seen. The look on her face said it all. She froze in the doorway, her eyes wide, like a deer caught in the headlights of a car that was about to hit her. I stood up, my hands shaking, but I didn't say anything. I couldn't. The words were lodged somewhere in my throat, stuck behind the wall of anger and pain that was threatening to choke me. She opened her mouth to speak, to explain, to lie. Who knows? But I didn't want to hear it. I couldn't hear it. I just needed to get out of there. Without a word, I shoved the phone into her hands and walked out the door. I didn't know where I was going. I didn't care. I just needed to get away. Away from her, from Mike, from the life I thought we had. I walked for what felt like hours, the cold night air doing nothing to cool the fire raging inside me. Every step felt like 1,000 pounds were pressing down on me, but I kept moving. I couldn't stop. If I stopped, I'd have to think, and I wasn't ready for that yet. Eventually, I found myself at the edge of the city, where the streets were quieter and the world seemed a little less cruel. I sat down on a bench, my head in my hands, trying to make sense of it all. But there was no making sense of this. There was no reason, no justification that could make what Sarah and Mike had done any less painful. I don't know how long I sat there, staring at nothing, before I finally headed back home. The apartment was dark when I got there, the only light coming from the street lamps outside. Sarah was sitting on the couch, her knees pulled up to her chest, her eyes red and puffy from crying. I didn't say anything. I didn't need to. The silence between us said more than words ever could. Days passed, and I didn't talk to her. I didn't talk to anyone. I went to band rehearsals, played the notes I'd memorized, but my heart wasn't in it. Every time I looked at Mike, all I could see was betrayal. He acted like nothing had happened, like everything was normal, and that made it even worse. How could he pretend like this? Like he hadn't just destroyed everything. I wanted to punch him, to scream at him, to make him feel the same pain he'd made me feel. But I didn't. I stayed silent, just like always. It was easier that way. But even silence couldn't protect me from what was coming next. It was a Tuesday when everything changed. Sarah had texted me earlier that day, asking if we could talk. I hadn't responded. I wasn't ready. Not yet. But then, later that night, I got the call. An accident. A car crash. Sarah had been on her way to meet Mike. Of course she was. But something had gone wrong. She'd lost control of the car, and now she was in the hospital. I rushed there, my heart pounding in my chest. Despite everything, despite the betrayal, I couldn't just abandon her. I still cared. I still loved her, as much as it hurt to admit. When I got to the hospital, the doctors told me the news. Sarah was alive, but her vocal cords had been severely damaged in the crash. She might never speak again. I stood there, numb as the words sunk in. Sarah, the woman who had always been so full of life, so loud and expressive, might never sing again, might never speak again. And I, who had spent my whole life in silence, was the only one who could truly understand what she was going through. When I finally saw her, lying in that hospital bed, she looked so small, so fragile. Her eyes flickered open when she saw me, and I could see the pain, the regret, written all over her face. She couldn't speak, couldn't explain, couldn't apologize. All she could do was reach out her hand, and I, for reasons I still don't fully understand, took it. Sitting beside Sarah's hospital bed, everything felt unreal. Her hand in mine was warm, trembling slightly. She blinked slowly, her face pale against the sterile white of the hospital sheets. I didn't know what to say, what to think. The woman I loved, who had betrayed me with my best friend, now lay silent, unable to speak, unable to explain, and I didn't know if I even wanted her to. The doctor said there was a chance, a small one, that with surgery and therapy she might regain her voice. But it was just as likely that she never would. I should have felt something, anger, grief, relief even, but all I felt was numb. Sarah squeezed my hand gently, her eyes filling with tears. I knew what she wanted to say, what she would have said if she could. I'm sorry. But she couldn't, and maybe that was for the best. Apologies wouldn't fix what had been broken between us. Nothing could. The silence between us stretched on, heavier than any words. I looked at her, really looked at her for the first time since all of this had started. She looked so vulnerable, so fragile. The vibrant, confident woman I had fallen in love with was gone, replaced by this quiet, shattered version of her. I wanted to feel pity, to feel empathy for what she was going through, but I couldn't get past the hurt, the betrayal. Every time I looked at her, I saw the texts. I saw Mike. The anger I'd buried so deep started to bubble up, but I swallowed it down. This wasn't the time. She needed me now, more than ever. And despite everything, I couldn't just walk away. I couldn't leave her like this. I stayed with her that night, watching as she drifted in and out of sleep. The nurses came and went, adjusting her IV, checking her vitals, but I barely noticed them. My mind was too full, too chaotic, spinning with thoughts I didn't want to face. How had it come to this? How had everything fallen apart so quickly? In the early hours of the morning, I finally left the hospital, exhausted and emotionally drained. I didn't go home. I couldn't. The thought of being in that apartment, surrounded by memories of us, of what we used to be, was too much, so I wandered, aimless, through the empty streets, the city still asleep around me. When the sun started to rise, I found myself standing in front of Mike's apartment. My fists clenched at my sides, my heart pounding in my chest. Part of me wanted to storm in there, to demand answers, to punch him in the face and make him feel the same pain I was feeling. But I didn't. Instead, I just stood there, staring up at the window, my thoughts a mess of anger and confusion. Eventually, I turned and walked away. There was no point. Confronting Mike wouldn't change anything. It wouldn't fix what was broken. When I finally made it back to the apartment, it felt like I was stepping into a different life. The life I had before, the life with Sarah, the life with music, the life with trust, it was gone. All that was left was the wreckage. Days passed, and I went back to the hospital every day. Sarah couldn't speak, but we didn't need words to communicate. She would write things down on a notepad, little messages like "thank you" and "I'm sorry." Always, "I'm sorry." It was like she thought saying it over and over again, even in writing, would somehow make everything okay. But it didn't. I didn't respond to her apologies. I didn't know how. What was I supposed to say? That it was okay? That I forgave her? I didn't. I couldn't. But I stayed. I stayed because I couldn't leave her like this. As much as I hated what she had done, I couldn't just abandon her when she needed me. That wasn't who I was. That wasn't who I wanted to be. One afternoon, a week after the accident, Sarah handed me a note. "I want to go home." The words were simple, but the weight behind them was heavy. Taking her home meant facing the reality of our situation. It meant acknowledging that our relationship, whatever it was now, wasn't over. It meant dealing with the fallout of her betrayal and figuring out what came next. But I couldn't say no. So I nodded, and the next day, I brought her home. The apartment felt different when we walked in. It was like the air itself had changed. Everything was the same, but nothing was. Sarah moved slowly, carefully, still recovering from her injuries. She sat down on the couch, her eyes scanning the room like she was seeing it for the first time. I stood awkwardly by the door, unsure of what to do, unsure of what to say. This was our home, but it didn't feel like it anymore. It felt like a stranger's place. For the next few days, we settled into an uneasy routine. I took care of her, helping her with simple tasks, and she communicated through notes or gestures. We didn't talk about the affair. We didn't talk about Mike. It was like we were both avoiding the elephant in the room, pretending that everything was normal when it was anything but. I went back to rehearsals with the band, though it was more out of habit than anything else. Every time I saw Mike, the anger flared up again, but I kept it in check. I played the notes, went through the motions, but my heart wasn't in it. The music felt hollow now, tainted by everything that had happened. Mike tried to talk to me a few times, tried to act like everything was fine, but I ignored him. I couldn't pretend, not like he could. One day, after rehearsal, I found him waiting outside the studio, leaning against the wall like nothing had changed. "Ethan," he said, his voice low, almost apologetic. "We need to talk." I didn't respond. I didn't even look at him. I just kept walking, my fists clenched at my sides. "I know you're angry," he called after me, "and you have every right to be. But it wasn't all Sarah's fault. I pushed her. I made the first move. If you're going to blame someone, blame me." His words stopped me in my tracks. I turned slowly, my jaw tight, my heart pounding in my chest. "You think that makes it better?" I signed, my hands moving sharply through the air. "You think that excuses what you did?" Mike ran a hand through his hair, looking frustrated. "No, of course not. I'm just trying to explain." "I don't care." I cut him off, my hands trembling. "I don't care why you did it. You were my best friend. You were supposed to have my back, and instead you stabbed me in it." He opened his mouth to say something else, but I didn't give him the chance. I turned and walked away, the weight of his betrayal settling even heavier on my shoulders. Back at the apartment, Sarah was sitting at the kitchen table when I walked in. She looked up at me, her eyes filled with guilt. She held out a note she had written earlier. "We need to talk about what happened." I stared at the note for a long time, the words blurring in front of my eyes. This was it, the moment I had been avoiding, the moment I had been dreading. We were finally going to talk about the affair, finally going to confront the thing that had been hanging over us like a dark cloud since the accident. I sat down across from her, my hands resting on the table, and nodded. It was time. Sarah sat across from me, her fingers nervously tracing the edge of the notepad she always carried now. She had written the words down, but she hadn't passed them to me yet. I could see the hesitation in her eyes, the uncertainty, and it made my chest tighten with a mix of anger and something else I couldn't quite place. Fear, maybe, or sadness. But it was time. We couldn't keep going like this, living in the same space, pretending everything was fine when we were both suffocating under the weight of what had happened. She slid the note across the table, and I stared at it for a moment before picking it up. "We need to talk about what happened." Simple, direct. The words stared back at me, daring me to finally confront what I'd been avoiding. I put the note down and looked at her. Her eyes were wide, filled with guilt and pain, and for a brief moment I saw a flicker of the woman I used to love so deeply, the woman who once made me feel like anything was possible. But that woman was gone, and in her place was someone I barely recognized. I signed slowly, my hands heavy, like they were weighed down by all the things I hadn't said in weeks. Why? The question hung between us, suspended in the air. Her eyes filled with tears, and she quickly wiped them away, picking up the pen and notepad again. Her hands trembled as she wrote, and I waited, my heart pounding in my chest. She pushed the notepad back toward me, and I read her words. "I don't know. I clenched my jaw, the familiar anger rising up in me again. That's not good enough, I signed, my hands moving sharply. You had an affair with Mike, my best friend, the person I trusted more than anyone besides you. And you don't know why? She shook her head, tears spilling down her cheeks now. She grabbed the pen again, scribbling furiously on the notepad before pushing it back to me. I was scared. I didn't feel good enough for you anymore. You're always so sure of yourself, even with everything you've been through. And I'm not. I felt lost. I stared at the words, my mind racing. Lost? She felt lost. So she slept with my best friend? It didn't make any sense. I signed again more slowly this time, trying to keep my emotions in check. You should have talked to me, not to him. You should have come to me. She nodded, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. She scribbled another note, her handwriting shaky. I know. I'm so sorry, Ethan. I made a mistake, a huge mistake. I hate myself for it every day. I sat there for a moment, my eyes scanning the words over and over again. A mistake, a huge mistake. That's what she was calling it. A mistake. But mistakes happen by accident. They aren't premeditated. This wasn't some slip-up. This was a choice. She chose to betray me. She chose to go behind my back, and she did it for months. It wasn't a mistake, I signed, my hands trembling. It was a choice. You chose to lie to me. You chose to betray me. That wasn't some accident. You didn't trip and fall into his arms, Sarah. She sobbed harder, burying her face in her hands. I watched her, my own emotions swirling inside me like a storm I couldn't control. Part of me wanted to comfort her, to hold her and tell her it was going to be okay. But another part of me wanted to scream at her, to throw everything she had done back in her face. I sat back in my chair, taking a deep breath to calm myself down. Why him? I signed, my movements slower now. Why Mike? Of all people, why did it have to be him? She lifted her head, her face streaked with tears, and wrote another note. This one took longer, and I could tell she was struggling to find the right words. When she finally handed it to me, I read it slowly. Because he was there. He made me feel wanted when I didn't feel like I mattered to you anymore. But it wasn't real. It wasn't love. I know that now. I know I hurt you, and I hate myself for it. I crumpled the note in my hand, my anger flaring up again. You didn't feel like you mattered? I signed, my hands moving faster now. I've loved you since the day I met you. Everything I've done has been for us, for you. And you didn't feel like you mattered? She shook her head, tears spilling down her cheeks again, as she wrote another note. It wasn't about you. It was about me. I was broken, and I didn't know how to fix it. I made the wrong choice, and I'll regret it for the rest of my life. I stared at the note, my mind racing. Broken. She said she was broken, but weren't we all? I'd been through hell and back in my life, and I'd never once thought about doing what she did. I'd never once thought about betraying her the way she betrayed me. So now what? I signed, my movements slower again. What happens now, Sarah? You can't just expect everything to go back to the way it was. You can't just say you're sorry and hope that fixes everything. She shook her head, writing another note. I know that. I don't expect you to forgive me. I don't even know if I can forgive myself. But I want to try. I want to fix this if we can. I sat there in silence, staring at the words. She wanted to fix it. But how? How do you fix something that's been shattered into a million pieces? I didn't know if it was possible. And even if it was, I didn't know if I wanted to try. I stood up from the table, the chair scraping loudly against the floor. I need time, I signed, my hands shaking. I can't give you an answer right now. I don't know what I want. I don't know if I can ever trust you again. She nodded, tears still streaming down her face. She didn't try to stop me as I turned and walked out of the apartment, the weight of everything crashing down on me all at once. Outside, the air was cool, and I took a deep breath, trying to calm the storm of emotions inside me. I walked aimlessly, my thoughts swirling in 1,000 different directions. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know how to move forward from this. Could I forgive her? Could I ever look at her the same way again? I didn't have any answers, and for the first time in a long time, I felt completely lost. As I walked through the city streets, the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the sidewalk. I found myself back at the park, the same park I had wandered to the night I found out about the affair. I sat down on the same bench, my head in my hands, trying to make sense of everything. I wanted to forgive her. I wanted to believe that we could fix this, that we could find our way back to each other. But the betrayal still burned, deep and raw, and I didn't know if I could ever get past it. As the sky darkened, I pulled out my phone and stared at it for a long time. I had avoided talking to anyone about this, keeping it all bottled up inside. But I couldn't keep doing that. I needed to talk to someone, to get some kind of perspective. I scrolled through my contacts, my thumb hovering over my sister's name. She was the only person I could think of who might understand, who might be able to help me make sense of this mess. I hesitated for a moment, then pressed call. The phone rang twice before she picked up. "Ethan?" Her voice was soft, concerned. "What's going on? Are you okay?" I took a deep breath, the weight of everything pressing down on me again. "I don't know," I signed, even though she couldn't see me. I didn't have the words, but I needed to start somewhere. I sat there on the park bench, my phone pressed against my ear, listening to the faint crackle of the connection as my sister waited for me to speak. I had never been good with words, not out loud anyway. That was part of the reason music had become my outlet. Even though I couldn't hear it in the way most people did, I felt it. I lived in the vibrations, in the deep pulse that moved through me when I played. But now, even that felt hollow. Nothing made sense anymore, and I didn't know how to explain that to her. Finally, I forced myself to speak. "I don't know how to do this," I said, my voice sounding rough in my own ears, like I hadn't used it in days. Maybe I hadn't, not for anything that mattered. "Everything's a mess. Sarah, she cheated with Mike." There was a long pause on the other end of the line, and for a moment I thought maybe the call had dropped. But then my sister let out a quiet breath. "Oh, Ethan," she whispered, her voice full of sympathy. "I'm so sorry. I don't even know what to say." Neither did I. I had no idea what I wanted to hear from her, if anything. I just needed to tell someone, to get it out of my head, to make it real outside of myself. I leaned forward on the bench, my elbows resting on my knees as I stared at the ground. "I don't know if I can forgive her," I admitted, the words spilling out before I had a chance to think them through. "But I don't know how to walk away either." "She hurt you," my sister said gently, "and no one expects you to have the answers right now. This isn't something you can just fix overnight. It's going to take time, a lot of time." "I don't know if time is enough," I said. "How am I supposed to trust her again? How am I supposed to trust anyone after this?" "I don't have those answers," she said, "but I do know that you need to give yourself some grace. This is a huge betrayal, Ethan. It's okay to be angry. It's okay to feel hurt." I nodded, even though she couldn't see me. I knew she was right, but it didn't make the weight on my chest any lighter. I had been holding it all in for so long that it felt like I was drowning under the pressure. "She lost her voice," I said, my words coming out in a rush. "In the accident. The doctors don't know if she'll ever be able to speak again." There was another pause, and I could practically feel my sister processing that. "Ethan, that's awful. How is she handling it?" "She's devastated," I said, remembering the look on Sarah's face when they had told her the news. "She used to sing. That was her thing, and now she can't even speak." I rubbed a hand over my face, feeling the exhaustion seeping into my bones. "I don't know what to do. I can't leave her like this, but every time I look at her, all I can think about is what she did." "You don't have to decide anything right now," my sister said. "You've been through so much already. Just take it one day at a time, and if you need to talk, I'm here, okay?" "Okay," I said, even though I didn't feel any more sure about what I was supposed to do. But at least I had gotten it out, and for now, that was enough. We hung up a few minutes later, and I stayed on the bench, staring at the darkening sky as the stars began to peek through the clouds. I didn't move for a long time, just letting the quiet of the park settle over me. Eventually, though, I knew I couldn't avoid going home any longer. Sarah was probably waiting for me, and as much as I dreaded the thought of facing her again, I had to go back. When I got to the apartment, the lights were on, casting a soft glow through the windows. I hesitated at the door, my hand hovering over the doorknob. Part of me wanted to turn around, to walk away and never come back, but I couldn't. Not yet. I opened the door quietly and stepped inside. Sarah was sitting at the kitchen table, her notepad in front of her, a pen clutched in her hand. She looked up when I walked in, her eyes searching my face, and for a moment, neither of us moved. Then she scribbled something on the notepad and slid it across the table to me. I didn't want to read it. I didn't want to know what she had to say. But I forced myself to look down at the page. "I'm glad you came back." I didn't respond right away. I wasn't sure what to say. Instead, I walked over to the counter and poured myself a glass of water, trying to give myself a minute to gather my thoughts. When I finally turned back to her, she was watching me, waiting. "I needed some air," I said, though it felt like such an inadequate explanation for everything that had been swirling in my mind. "I talked to my sister." Sarah nodded, her expression unreadable. She picked up the pen again and wrote another note. "Did it help?" I shrugged, taking a sip of water before setting the glass down on the counter. "I don't know. It helped to talk about it, I guess, but nothing feels resolved." She bit her lip, her eyes glistening with unshed tears as she wrote again. "I know it's not enough, but I'm really sorry, Ethan. I wish I could take it all back." I read the words, my chest tightening again. I wanted to believe her. I wanted to believe that she was truly sorry, that she regretted what she had done. But forgiveness wasn't something that could be handed out so easily. "I don't know how to forgive you," I admitted. "I don't know if I can." She flinched at my words, and for a moment I regretted the harshness of them. But I didn't take them back. She needed to know how deeply she had hurt me. "I understand," she wrote. "I don't expect you to forgive me right away, but I want to try to make it up to you. I want to try to fix this, if you'll let me." I didn't know what to say to that. Part of me wanted to say no, to walk away and never look back. But another part of me, an admittedly small part, wondered if maybe, just maybe, we could find our way through this. I didn't have the answers yet, and I wasn't ready to make that decision. "I need more time," I said, my voice quiet. "I'm not ready to figure this out yet." She nodded, wiping a tear from her cheek as she scribbled another note. "I'll wait as long as you need." We sat in silence for a while after that, the weight of everything hanging between us. Eventually, I stood up and went to the bedroom, leaving her alone at the table. I didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but for now, I just needed to sleep. I needed to clear my head, to figure out what came next. The next morning, I woke up early, the sunlight streaming through the window. Sarah was still asleep when I got up, her notepad resting on the nightstand beside her. I looked at her for a moment, studying the lines of her face, the way her brow furrowed slightly, even in sleep. She looked peaceful, but I knew the weight of what we were dealing with would be there when she woke up. I slipped out of the room quietly and made my way to the kitchen, pouring myself a cup of coffee as I tried to sort through the jumble of thoughts in my head. I still didn't have any answers, but I knew I couldn't keep avoiding the truth. Sarah had hurt me in a way I hadn't thought possible, and even though part of me wanted to forgive her, I didn't know if I could ever trust her again. As I sipped my coffee, my phone buzzed on the counter. It was a text from Mike. I stared at the screen, my stomach twisting in knots. He hadn't tried to reach out since the last time we'd spoken, and I wasn't sure I wanted to hear what he had to say. But curiosity got the better of me, and I opened the message. "Can we talk, please?" I stared at the words for a long time, my mind racing. Mike had been my best friend for years, and now he was just another person who had betrayed me. I didn't know if I wanted to hear him out, but part of me felt like I needed to. If nothing else, I needed closure. I needed to understand why he had done what he did. I set my coffee cup down and typed out a quick response. "Meet me at the park in an hour." As soon as I hit send, I felt a wave of anxiety wash over me. This was going to be hard, but it was something I had to do. I couldn't keep avoiding it forever. When I got to the park, Mike was already there, sitting on the same bench where I had sat the night I found out about the affair. He looked up when he saw me, his expression full of guilt. For a moment, neither of us said anything. Finally, I broke the silence. Mike looked up at me from the bench, his expression filled with the kind of regret that I wasn't sure I could believe. He looked smaller somehow, like the weight of what he had done had pressed down on him, crushing him. I stood a few feet away, my hands clenched into fists at my sides, trying to figure out how to even begin this conversation. The silence between us was thick, but I wasn't going to let it stretch on forever. I don't even know what to say, I finally said, my voice low and rough. You were my best friend, Mike, my brother, and you did this to me. Mike's face crumpled, his shoulders slumping as he looked down at his feet. I know, Ethan, I know, and I swear to you, if I could take it back, I would, but I can't. I made a terrible mistake, and I hate myself for it every single day. Mistake? I repeated, my voice rising. You call it a mistake? You slept with her for months. That's not a mistake, Mike. That's a choice, a deliberate, calculated choice. He flinched at my words, but I didn't care. I wasn't going to sugarcoat this for him. He needed to feel the full weight of what he had done. I know it was a choice, Mike said quietly, and it was the wrong one. I can't make excuses for myself. I betrayed you, and I betrayed our friendship. I don't expect you to forgive me, but I needed to tell you that I'm sorry. I needed you to hear it from me. I crossed my arms over my chest, trying to hold back the storm of emotions that threatened to overwhelm me. Why? I asked. Why did you do it? Mike ran a hand through his hair, letting out a shaky breath. I don't know. I wish I could give you some clear answer, but I can't. At first, it was just a stupid flirtation. Sarah and I were spending more time together because of the band, and I guess I let myself get caught up in the attention. It was wrong. I knew it was wrong, but I did it anyway. And then, it escalated. One bad decision after another. I stared at him, my stomach churning with disgust. How could he stand there and say that it just happened? Like they were powerless to stop it? Like it wasn't a series of conscious choices? I don't care how it started, Mike, I said, my voice sharp. What I care about is the fact that you kept doing it. You had so many chances to stop, to tell me the truth. But you didn't. You kept lying to my face. Both of you. I know, Mike whispered, his eyes brimming with tears. I know, and I'll regret it for the rest of my life. I lost you. I lost my best friend, and I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I had to try. I had to tell you that I'm sorry. I shook my head, feeling the anger boiling up inside me. Sorry isn't enough, I snapped. Sorry doesn't fix anything. You shattered my trust. You destroyed my relationship. You broke everything, Mike. And for what? For what, exactly? Mike didn't answer right away. He just sat there, staring at the ground, looking like he didn't have a single excuse left to give. And maybe he didn't. Maybe there was no excuse that could ever make sense of what he had done. I don't know, he finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. I don't know why I did it, Ethan. I wasn't thinking. I wasn't considering the consequences. But I know I was wrong. I know I ruined everything. I let out a bitter laugh, shaking my head. Yeah, you did. You ruined everything. And the worst part is, you didn't just ruin it for me. You ruined it for her, too. She's paying for this just as much as I am. Mike looked up at me, confusion crossing his face. What do you mean? I hesitated for a moment before answering. Sarah lost her voice in the accident. She might never speak again. His eyes widened in shock, his mouth opening and closing as he tried to process what I had just said. I didn't know, he stammered. I had no idea. Ethan, I'm so sorry. Yeah, I said coldly. You should be. We stood there in silence for a long time after that, the weight of everything pressing down on us. I didn't know what else there was to say. Mike had apologized, but it didn't change anything. It didn't make the pain go away. It didn't make me trust him again. I don't know if I can forgive you, I said quietly. Maybe someday, but not now. Right now, I just need space. I need time to figure out how to move forward. Mike nodded, his face pale and drawn. I understand, and I'll give you all the space you need. Just know that I'm here. If you ever want to talk, if you ever want to yell at me again, I'll be here. I didn't respond to that. I wasn't ready to think about what would happen in the future. All I knew was that I couldn't keep standing there, staring at him, feeling the weight of his betrayal hanging between us. I have to go, I said, my voice hoarse. Take care, Mike. And with that, I turned and walked away, leaving him sitting there on the bench, looking as broken as I felt. As I walked back toward the apartment, my mind raced with everything that had been said. I didn't know if I could ever truly forgive him. I didn't know if I could ever look at him the same way again. But at least I had heard him out. At least I had said what I needed to say. When I got home, Sarah was sitting on the couch, her notepad resting on her lap. She looked up when I walked in, her eyes filled with uncertainty. I didn't say anything at first. I just stood there, trying to figure out what I was supposed to do now. After a moment, she picked up the pen and started writing, then handed me the note. How did it go? I stared at the words for a moment before answering. It went about how I expected. He apologized. He said he didn't know why he did it, but it didn't make me feel any better. She nodded slowly, her eyes downcast as she scribbled another note. I didn't expect it to. I walked over to the chair across from her and sat down, running a hand through my hair. I don't know what to do, Sarah. I don't know how to move forward. I feel like I'm stuck in this limbo, and I don't know if I can ever get out. She bit her lip, her eyes filling with tears as she wrote another note. I'll do whatever it takes, Ethan. I'll wait as long as you need. I just want to fix this. I let out a heavy sigh, leaning back in the chair. I don't know if we can fix this. I don't know if I can trust you again. Every time I look at you, I see what you did. I see the betrayal, and it's like a knife in my chest over and over again. Her face crumpled, and she wiped at her eyes, struggling to keep her emotions in check. She wrote another note, her hand shaking as she passed it to me. I know, and I hate myself for what I did. I hate that I hurt you, but I love you, Ethan. I love you more than anything, and I'll do whatever it takes to earn back your trust, even if it takes years. I stared at the note, the words blurring in front of my eyes. I wanted to believe her. I wanted to believe that we could somehow rebuild what had been broken. But I didn't know if love was enough. Not after everything that had happened. I need more time, I said quietly. I don't know what I want yet, but I'm not ready to make any decisions. She nodded, her eyes filled with a mix of hope and sadness. She didn't try to push me. She didn't try to force anything. She just sat there, waiting, giving me the space I needed. And for now, that was enough. The days that followed were slow, a blur of awkward silences and tentative steps towards something that neither of us could define. We fell into a routine of sorts. I went to band rehearsals, though they felt more like a chore than anything else. Mike kept his distance, and I was grateful for that. I wasn't ready to face him again. At home, Sarah and I communicated mostly through notes, though sometimes I would catch her watching me, as if she was waiting for something, some sign that things were going to be okay. But I didn't have that sign to give her. I was still lost, still unsure of what the future held. All I knew was that I wasn't ready to give up. Not yet. One evening, after dinner, Sarah handed me a new note, her eyes filled with uncertainty. Can we work on music together? I miss it. I hesitated for a moment, then nodded. It had been weeks since we'd played together, and maybe music was the one thing that could help us reconnect. I stared at the note Sarah handed me, my heart heavy. Can we work on music together? I miss it. Those words hit me in a place I hadn't expected. Music had always been our connection, our shared language. Even when I couldn't hear the notes the way she did, we'd always found a way to feel them together. For a moment, I wasn't sure how to respond. I wasn't sure if I was ready to let her back into that part of me. But then I thought about how much I missed it too. Missed the way we used to create something together that felt bigger than the both of us. So I nodded. I couldn't promise her more than that, not yet, but this was something I could try. The smallest of steps forward. We set up in the living room later that night, pulling out the keyboard and a few of the instruments we hadn't touched in weeks. Sarah moved quietly, her hands light on the keys, testing out the feel of it again. Her expression was different this time, more tentative, less confident. She wasn't the same person who used to sit here and sing freely, her voice filling every corner of the room. Now, she was almost shy, careful in a way that I had never seen before. I sat on the edge of the couch, my fingers resting on my guitar, not playing anything yet. Just watching her, waiting to see how this would go. Part of me felt like I was watching a stranger, someone I used to know, but who had changed in ways I wasn't sure I understood. Sarah started first, her hands moving slowly over the keys, playing a soft melody that was familiar but different. It was one of the songs we had written together, back when things were easier, back when everything between us was uncomplicated. But there was a new fragility to it now, a softness that made it feel like a completely different piece of music. I closed my eyes and let the vibrations of the notes move through me. It was strange, feeling the music in this way again after everything that had happened. but at the same time, it was comforting. This was the one place where things made sense, where there weren't any words or lies or betrayals, just sound, just emotion. Without thinking, I started to play along. My fingers moved instinctively over the strings, finding the rhythm that matched her melody. The guitar vibrated under my hands, and for a moment I let myself get lost in it. I wasn't thinking about what had happened or where we stood now. I was just playing. Sarah's eyes flicked up to mine as we played, and I saw something there I hadn't seen in weeks. It wasn't quite hope, but it was close. Maybe it was the recognition that even after everything, this was still something we could share. Something we hadn't lost. As the song ended, we both sat there for a moment in the quiet that followed. Neither of us said anything, but I could feel the tension between us start to ease just the tiniest bit. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't healing, but it was something. We kept playing like that for the next few nights. Small sessions in the living room where we barely spoke, but found a way to connect through the music. It became our routine. It wasn't the way things used to be, but in those moments, it felt like a tiny step towards something new. One night, after we had finished playing, Sarah handed me a note. "Thank you for doing this with me. It means more than you know." I read it and nodded, not trusting myself to say more. She didn't push. She just gave me a small, sad smile and went to bed. Time passed, and I found myself thinking about our future in a way I hadn't allowed myself to before. Could we really move past this? Could we rebuild what had been broken? I didn't know, but every time we sat down to make music together, I felt a little closer to figuring it out. Then, one day, something shifted. We were in the middle of playing a new song, something soft and slow that we had been working on for a while, when Sarah stopped suddenly. She looked at me, her eyes filled with a mix of fear and determination. She grabbed her notepad and wrote something down before handing it to me. "I want to try something," the note read. "I want to sing." I blinked, taken aback by her words. She hadn't even tried to speak since the accident, and now she wanted to sing? I wasn't sure how to respond. Part of me wanted to protect her, to tell her it was too soon, that she should take it easy. But the other part of me knew that she needed this. She needed to try, to see if there was any part of her old self that she could reclaim. I nodded slowly, giving her the go-ahead. She took a deep breath, her hands trembling slightly as she positioned herself in front of the microphone we had set up. I watched her carefully, my heart pounding in my chest, not knowing what to expect. She opened her mouth, and at first there was nothing, just silence. Her lips moved, but no sound came out. I could see the frustration on her face, the fear that maybe she really had lost her voice forever. But then slowly something happened. A sound, barely a whisper at first, but it was there. Her voice. It was weak, fragile, but it was real. She kept going, pushing herself, her voice growing stronger with each note. It wasn't the same as before. It didn't have the power or the range that it used to, but it was still her. Still Sarah. As she sang, I felt something break open inside me. All the anger, all the pain, all the resentment I had been holding on to, it started to loosen its grip on me. This woman, standing in front of me, singing with everything she had, was the same woman I had loved for years. The same woman who had made a terrible mistake, yes, but also the woman who was trying so desperately to make things right. When she finished, she looked at me, tears streaming down her face. She didn't need to write anything down this time. I knew what she was trying to say. I stood up, my guitar forgotten, and crossed the room to her. Without thinking, I wrapped my arms around her, pulling her close. She sobbed into my chest, her body shaking as she clung to me, and for the first time since this whole nightmare had started, I let myself hold her. I let myself feel the weight of everything we had lost and everything we were trying to rebuild. It wasn't forgiveness, not completely, but it was the first step. Over the next few weeks, we kept working on her voice. It wasn't easy. Some days were better than others, and there were times when I could see the frustration and disappointment in her eyes. But she kept going, and so did I. There were still moments when the past crept in, when I would look at her and remember what she had done, and the pain would come rushing back. But those moments were becoming less frequent, and in their place, something new was growing, something fragile but real. One evening, As we were sitting on the couch after a long day, Sarah handed me another note. I know it's been hard, but I love you, Ethan. I always have, and I'm going to keep fighting for us, no matter how long it takes. I read the note and looked at her, feeling the weight of her words. I didn't know if we would ever be the same as we were before. I didn't know if we would ever fully heal from what had happened. But I knew that I wasn't ready to give up. I love you too, I said softly, the words feeling heavy and strange on my tongue, but true. She smiled at me, that same sad but hopeful smile she had given me so many times before. And in that moment, I realized that maybe love wasn't about being perfect. Maybe it wasn't about never making mistakes. Maybe it was about choosing to stay, even when things were broken. Choosing to fight, even when it felt impossible. We weren't fixed, we weren't whole, but we were trying, and for now, that was enough.